Hey everyone, and welcome back to CloudEagle SaaS Masterminds podcast. I'm your host Divya, and this show is really all about getting into the trenches with IT leaders who are dealing with real operational challenges, not just the theoretical concepts you read about in white papers. So today we are tackling something that I think is top of the mind for a lot of executives: why identity governance is under more scrutiny than ever. And here's the thing. As organizations are adopting more and more applications, the SaaS sprawl is real, and they are empowering business teams, moving faster than ever. Access risk has quietly become one of those persistent problems that's hiding in plain sight. It's there, and everyone kind of knows it's there, but it often doesn't get the attention it deserves until something really goes wrong. Anyway, we have got a fantastic guest today to help us unpack all of this. Joining us is Charles Phillips, an IT leader with a great experience driving digital transformation while keeping execution and accountability front and center. Charles, welcome to the show. And thanks
Hello,
for being here.
glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's jump right in. To set the stage for our listeners, like, could you briefly introduce yourself, your current role, and give us a primer of the IT challenges you're spending most of your time, solving these days.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. My name's Charles Phillips, and I'm the Salesforce Operations Manager and Product Owner for Salesforce at UT Health San Antonio. A little bit of current news around UT Health San Antonio. UT Health San Antonio and UTSA here in San Antonio, Texas, two very large institutions in their own right here in the state of Texas. We're merging. So we're merging together, we're coming together, and we're going to create one of the largest academic and healthcare institutions in the state. So it's an exciting time to be a part of these two institutions. And, Salesforce is going to play a major role in how we connect with our students on the academic side, as well as with our patients on the healthcare side. I stepped in this role a few months ago with a background in project program and portfolio management. I've always focused heavily on building of governance as it relates to sustainability for my projects. Always trying to make sure that the platforms are built to scale, not just launched and kind of set and forget type of strategy. We want it to be long-term, scalable, and be able to grow with the organization. A little bit more about my team. So my team handles the day-to-day Salesforce operations, enhancement requests, any kind of little small project that comes up. But we also prepare the requirements for larger initiatives that might take place with a consulting partner. I also oversee FormStack, our backup solutions, as well as a couple other peripheral tools that work within the Salesforce ecosystem. I think when you talk about challenges, one of our biggest challenges right now, especially with the merger going on, is the maturing of governance and the change management associated with that. Moving from an organic early implementation, our implementation is about 2 years old at this point, so it was very organic, very, sprung up in different areas with not as much consistency in the areas as maybe we would have liked now. But it was good. It came about quickly and it's grown, it's blossomed. But now it's time to look at more consistent processes. What does our intake models look like? And how do we align all of our stakeholders around some common language and processes? Like most IT teams, we're constantly balancing the keeping the lights on with building for the future, which is always challenging. We're aligning many parts of the organization or trying to align them under a common architecture and ways of working, but we have to balance that with just the day-to-day operations, which is always a challenge in any organization.
Yeah, that really resonates. I mean, the balance that you just mentioned, right? Keeping the lights on versus building for tomorrow. Yeah, that's the central challenge every IT leader faces, isn't it? Yeah. So you have seen identity governance discussed across different stages of organizational maturity, and I'm curious, at what point does it stop being a technical concern and actually become a leadership problem?
In my experience, governance really stops being a technical concern almost immediately. it's fundamentally a leadership responsibility, in my opinion. Um, you can create these pockets of good governance within individual teams, but without the executive sponsorship and buy-in and that top-down alignment, those efforts kind of remain fragmented and they're really hard to sustain in their little silos. So, true operational maturity comes when the leaders, they set the tone, they define the principles, the enforcement standards, the teeth behind making that governance work, really ensuring that all the lines of business are operating under the same playbook and under the same understanding. When that doesn't happen, you can end up with technical sprawl just because the guardrails aren't there or they're not well established. Definitely some disconnected systems, inconsistent processes. Absolutely, that's another big one. And I think those things combined really make it hard long term for IT teams to sustain those varying different ways of operating as well as system architecture. So while governance shows up, I think in the initial onset of a system's being as a technical issue, it quickly moves into a leadership issue because once you step back and you start taking a holistic look at the system, from an enterprise view, it's a leadership problem. And strong, scalable identity governance, it's only going to work if leadership not only is involved, but they have also got to champion it and embed it into the organization's operations.
I love that, and it's interesting because, I think a lot of organizations, they kind of start with the tech, right? They buy the tool and they think that they have solved the problem. But, if leadership is important, you're really just addressing the symptoms without, treating the underlying condition, right? Yeah, so let's talk about why the scrutiny has been intensified, right? Like we actually published an IGA report at CloudEagle with some pretty eye-opening findings, right? And it shows that over 80% of organizations are still depending on manual access reviews despite significant investment in identity tools, right? Like, so in your view, why has governance failed to mature at the same pace as identity infrastructure? What's the disconnect there?
I think the distinction between, what each of those are. So the identity infrastructure, that's the tech. It's the systems that are con or that are that give the access, or that are controlling how the access is provided. But the governance on the other side of that, the governance, that's the organizational framework. That's the policies, the oversight, that's the alignment from, the top down that we just talked about. So while infrastructure can advance quickly with the technology or quicker with the technology, governance relies on leadership buy-in, cultural shifts, change management, and that's why governance oftentimes, many times, lags far behind, because it involves people, it involves processes, and it involves priorities. And those things, anyone who's worked in the corporate setting, those are not easy things to wrangle and to get all aligned. It takes time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, the tech can move at the speed of a software, but culture absolutely not, right? That requires a fundamentally different approach and timeline, right? So here's
Correct.
something have been noticing, and maybe you're seeing this too. Identity questions are coming up more often in audits, security reviews, even board discussions. Like, what changed in the operating environment to drive that visibility? Why is everyone suddenly asking about this?
So I think identity is more visible now, because we're seeing it in increasingly more sophisticated threats that exploit the gaps in our access. Alongside that, cloud adoption and remote work, they've kind of expanded the risk surface that's associated with what opportunities those bad actors have to exploit. So, while are dealing with that, regulations have also started to raise concerns and they're trying to drive accountability to make up for that. So then, on the other hand, you have regulations and audits which are focusing more on access, So you put all these together, and kind of it puts identity front and center for what leadership and auditors are most talking about, because it's just such a big threat now because of the expansive nature of where we're going with where we're going in IT terms.
Yeah, and I imagine the regulators are maintaining pretty high expectations as well, aren't they? So let's dig into something a little more nuanced here. Like in your experience, and I'm really curious about this, like which creates greater long-term risk? Is it lack of visibility into access, or is it misplaced confidence in control, like that appears mature?
So, this is a great question. I think when you talk about the two types of risks, they're distinct. Yet, I think you're splitting hairs between the two because there's some recent examples that show why that is. Both of those both of those opportunities are really really need to be at the forefront of the focus of a governance policy. The Kronos incident, for those of us that remember it, was a very, very bad time. It was a major payroll provider, was faced with a ransomware attack, caused a lot of downtime, caused a lot of disruption across the globe. During the after action review, what they found was that in the Kronos event, confidence in the controls masked the vulnerabilities, which led to opportunities for the bad actors to disrupt the systems. Now, on the other hand, you have the hotelier breach, which exposed guest data across major hotel brands because they had some unforeseen access risks. Now, the hotelier breach, a little older example than the Kronos one, but a very interesting example for those of you listening that aren't familiar with it. I highly recommend looking at that case study because very classic example of unseen and unmitigated access risk becoming a major problem over a number of years. But I think both of these events are cautionary tales that whether it's hidden access gaps or overconfident confidence in your controls, both of these things can lead to major incidents if they're not mitigated appropriately. So you need to account for both in a strong governance strategy because, again, it's not one or the other. It's both.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's really about, it's about defending against both vulnerabilities simultaneously, right? Yeah. So
Yes.
here's another thing I think flies under the radar. Role changes tend to introduce more access risk than new hires, right? Like why is internal movement so consistently underestimated? Like what's going on there?
Well, in my experience, I think internal movement is often underestimated because it's familiar. When we hire someone new, every access point is carefully assigned and evaluated if they need that access because we're bringing in someone new. But when we have a longtime employee that's changing roles, there's, I think, more of a sense to trust that and have a comfort level with adding that access or changing that access. It feels like we're not just adding access, but this is kind of an evolution of this person's role. So, there's this tendency to just, add more authority, more access to this person, and not view it as a risk the same way you would with someone that's new. Um, but that's exactly why I think these transitions slip under the radar is because of this familiarity. We're assuming that, hey, everything's above board and that, we're good to go. But in reality, that's kind of when the access creep starts to happen and why we need to apply the same rigor to both internal shifts as well as, new folks that are coming exposed to our data, getting access to our systems.
Right, right. Yeah, that's such an important insight. It's like we extend trust based on tenure. Like, but meanwhile, that employee now has accumulated access to multiple systems. They may no longer need for their current responsibilities, but
Hmm.
they still have that access, right? Yeah.
Correct.
So speaking of ownership, here's a recurring issue I keep hearing about, like weak business ownership of access decisions, right? Like what prevents access accountability, from sitting where it actually belongs. Why is this, such a sticky problem?
Access accountability often doesn't sit where it should because I think business owners don't fully understand the governance policies and processes behind the access. Um, and this goes back to leadership, really having buy-in on the governance and leading a top-down effort to enforce and implement a good, strong, mature governance policy. Because if you don't have leadership backing the alignment, the focus stays on keeping operations moving. That, folks down in the trenches, they're constantly focused. Keep the operations going, keep the train running. So rather than ownership of the process, they're looking at just getting the thing done that needs to keep the train running, right? So, all that to say that, if you've got weak ownership by intent, it's weak ownership because of incomplete understanding of the whole. How does access and why do we ask the questions we do around access? It's because of the governance. It's because of the importance of governance. But if we don't have that understanding and we can't, folks down in the trenches can't tie and link that to keeping the train running, then it just becomes null and void. And they go through the motions and the processes to keep operations going, to keep pace without asking the questions.
So it's not malicious. It's just they don't know what they don't know, right?
They don't know what they don't know, and the importance of it's just not stressed in their mind. So
Yeah.
they're doing what they know is important, which is keeping the train running, without realizing the overarching concern of, hey, it's not just what if we do something that causes the train to stop, and taking that little extra moment to think about access before just granting it to keep things going is an important thing.
Okay, so how should organizations structure access decisions so they are informed, deliberate, and but still practical at scale, right? Because I think that's the tension, right? Like you want rigor, but you can't slow the business now, right? So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so it needs to be a good mix. Organizations have to have a good mix of leadership buy-in, along with clear and consistent processes that make things work. First, leaderships, they've got to champion these governance frameworks, but second, everyone involved in the access decision needs to understand their role. Half the battle is people just knowing what they need to do. Um, if they don't know what they need to do, they're not going to do it. So they have to understand their role and the importance of their role in order to execute their part of it. And they need to follow a defined policy that ensures that each request is evaluated on its necessity and on its threat risk level. That's kind of the key to remaining a scalable model is to standardize it, keep it flexible, make it so that people can still get their business done, but it needs to be ingrained in the culture and the operating procedures so that it's not slowing down the train as much as possible, but it is a process that can be gone through in an equitable fashion to ensure that risks are mitigated and that access is being granted. Because what we're doing essentially when we grant access is we're granting people keys to the kingdom. You don't just give people keys to the kingdom, haphazardly. It's got to be informed, it's got to be deliberate, and but it does have to be practical.
Yeah, I love that phrase, keys to the kingdom. Because that's really what we are talking about here, right? Like let's talk about something that I think a lot of folks struggle with, like periodic access reviews. They often look really good on paper, but they fail operationally. So what breaks when governance is treated as just a point, just a point in time exercise?
I think when we get to treating governance as like a point in time exercise, we do a lot of I think we treat it kind of like a fire drill. Most of us remember, being in school, the fire drill would happen. We go through the motions, we go out to our area, we stand there for a while, and then we go back in. But we don't give it a whole lot of thought. We just kind of go through the motions, check the boxes, and after a while, after doing it a few times, it kind of just feels routine, but it doesn't necessarily feel lived, right? It's not a part of our everyday. We're just like, oh, it's a fire drill. When it happens, we execute we go through the motions. Um, I think in a true governance environment, it's an everyday security posture. So, it's not daytime or nighttime. It's whether it's February, December. It's not a point in time type of instance. It's an everyday instance. It's operationalized at that point. So whether you take a snapshot at any juncture at that point, you're seeing what happens all the time, not just what happens during the fire drill, right? This happens all the time, every day. It's just a snapshot of how we do business. So I think operationalizing the fire drill or operationalizing the governance that we put into play, I think goes to basically kind of ingraining it into the DNA of the folks at a organization and makes it stick better. When we treat it just like a point in time survey, it's going to be a point in time type of thing, and it's just not going to have as much meaning.
Absolutely. Like, I really like that analogy. Like, it's not a fire drill, it's simply how you operate day to day.
Yes.
So here's a tricky one. Like, how should leaders, distinguish between, access that is technically justified versus access that is operationally dangerous?
Yeah, so even if access is technically justified, it can expose sensitive data, or even worse, critical systems, expose critical systems beyond what's operationally safe. So I think a good example of this, and one that I have seen constantly comes up at any organization I've ever been, is the relationship between HR and IT. Because on the one hand, you have the need to make things happen, which where that relation IT facilitates HR's business functions, but HR has a lot of sensitive information. So exposing that information visibly to IT professionals who are not HR professionals is can be technically necessary in order to get things done, but is it justified? Is there protocols that have been put in place to make that work? So I think that's the most common example I see is that relationship between getting things done and risk threat level associated with HR and IT. But it really is a balancing act of asking ourselves the question, can we do this, but should we do this? And that ensures that if we're asking those questions, that we can still be safe in practice, but get things done and not get held up in the bureaucracy of it all. But I think that's a very what's one of those other balancing acts. You've got to be cognizant of, hey, we have to grant this access. We've got to do things, but we need to step back and ask some questions of should this be done or should it be done in a different way to make it safe?
Yeah, that's powerful distinction. Yeah, in our IGA research, like at Cloud, we found that many access issues only surface during audits or incidents, right? Like that's typically when organizations are scrambling. From your
Mhm.
experience, what early warning signs like tend to show up before, long before that, and what should leaders be watching for?
Well, I think the warning signs are usually there well before any audits or incidents happen. I'm kind of convinced of that. You'll often see outdated access that's never reviewed, temporary permissions that, kind of over time become permanent, or governance. This is the worst one too, that, governance discussions that perpetually get delayed because we've got other things to do. These are all warning signs of things that could potentially cause us problems in the future. And generally we don't really get these things don't get highlighted until the auditor comes around or until a major incident occurs. So I don't think it's blindness, but I think it's prioritization. I don't think if we're really honest with ourselves, I don't think it's being blind to the warning signs. I think it's, are we prioritizing the things that need to get done based on the warning signs we're seeing? So, if leaders can watch for these patterns and act on them, prioritize them and act on them before an audit or a incident happens, I think that that'll go a long way in preventing a lot of bad things from happening in our environments.
That's absolutely right. Like it's on the backlog, continuously, deprioritizing until it becomes a critical issue, right? And
Yes.
that demanding immediate attention, right? So on the flip
Yes.
side, like when identity governance works well, like really works well, like what leadership behaviors or decisions usually make the difference?
There's a term that I picked up a long time ago at a conference, but I think identity governance thrives when the leaders practice extreme ownership of the policies that they're putting into place. They're not just approving the policies, they're not just inking their name on the policy and then sending it on its way, but they're championing those policies. They're holding everyone accountable. They're asking the tough questions about access. They're embedded in governance in a daily decision-making way. They take action. They truly own the processes and the policies that they're putting forth for the organization to live by. So it's not just a side task. It's not just approval. It's part of their culture. It's part of the organizational culture that, we're owning these policies and we're seeing them through. So I think the biggest thing is when these leaders truly own the governance policies and procedures, it becomes proactive, it becomes consistent, it becomes natural for all the folks that, are downstream. If not, then it kind of remains an afterthought.
Yeah, that's the differentiator right there. Absolutely. Let's look ahead a bit. Like as organization give teams more and autonomy, like self-service capabilities, and democratizing access, and they automate more decisions. And how could the definition of acceptable access evolve?
So, as we grant teams more autonomy and automation takes over some of our decision-making processes, I think acceptable access needs to evolve to have really clear boundaries. Um, More so even than we have today. I think this autonomy and automation really requires prerequisite a lot of very clear boundaries. Leadership has to provide that top-down framework, the guidelines, most importantly, the parameters and the principles that define the limits of discretion. Because I think we do need discretion, but there's got to be parameters and guardrails to that discretion. Once that's set in place, I think teams can confidently kind of go forward, make decisions because they know what the boundaries are and the guardrails. They can make decisions within that. And as long as they're making a decision within the guardrails, then it's a good decision. I think this autonomy and automation thing is really only going to work if it's supported by a solid governance policy. Because I mean, you'll just have too many decisions and without the governance and without the guardrails, decisions of one person to a next can vary widely. So having at least the framework for make your decision within these two posts allows folks to make good, solid decisions that are in alignment with the whole organization as a whole.
I get it. Yeah. Autonomy, like without proper governance structure, is absolutely a recipe for risk exposure, I would say, right? And
Yes.
that brings us to the last question here. Like, I think it's a big one for experienced IT leaders. Like, what is the hardest shift required to move from reactive access cleanup to intentional governance?
Yeah, I think this takes us all the way back to kind of the intro I made about, kind of what my team spends its day doing. The hardest shift is balancing both of those worlds. We're always reacting, fixing legacy access issues, putting out fires of various types. But to move to intentional governance, we've got to carve out that time and that space to be able to build a forward-looking framework that's going to work and be scalable for us in the organization. It's not it's about shifting from being reactive to proactive, and I know that gets used so often and so frequently that I think it becomes mundane, but it's the truth. You've got to redirect your thinking from being reactive to the things going on to ensuring that you've got that proactive time to think ahead and do some planning, get a quiet space where you can do that and develop that framework, even while managing the daily demands of the organization. But I think that's the shift that is going to take organizations to the next level. I think if we can manage to do that and lead our folks to do that, that's going to really take governance to the next level.
Yeah, and that's the real challenge, isn't it? Like because your operational demands, they don't pause just because you want to be more strategic, right? Yeah.
Hmm.
Absolutely. So, this has been fantastic. Like so far, like we have got so much insight from you. And, thank you so much for sharing, your insights with us today. I really appreciate it. And, for our listeners, I think the key takeaway here is that intentional governance, that's what separates organizations, right? That stay in control from those that are constantly reacting to incidents. So if you're not thinking about this stuff proactively, now it's the time to start. Like Charles, thanks again, for sharing all these insights. It was, really helpful.
And thank you so much for having me.
Everyone, that's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.